The first part of this talk focused on the period 1824 to 1990, when scientists developed our understanding of the greenhouse effect, of global warming and of climate change. All terms unheard of when I was a boy, but now quite familiar to today's children. By 1990, scientists understood the science, and politicians and world leaders were left to chart a route out of the impending global crisis. When our grandchildren look back over the last 30 years of missed opportunities, of deceit, denial, disinterest and incompetence, they will rightly hold us all responsible for our lack of action. Over the last 30 years, scientists have continued to monitor the melting ice caps, the melting permafrost. They monitor the impact of deforestation on the planet's ability to absorb carbon. They investigated bleached coral reefs, the rise in ocean acidity and the rise in sea level. They model the potential impact of climate change on the planet as carbon dioxide levels continue to rise, updating their models as the situation continued to evolve. Since 1750, total global emissions of carbon dioxide are calculated to have reached 1,647 gigatons. Let's assume that the contents of this 1-pint beer glass will hold all the carbon dioxide, all the 1,647 gigatons of carbon dioxide, which we produced from 1750 to the present day. The carbon dioxide we produced in the period 1750 to 1990 would actually all fit into this half-pint glass, which in fact means that the amount of carbon dioxide produced in the last 30 years, since 1990, will fit in this second half-pint glass, and in fact it would now be beginning to overflow. And now you can see why after 30 years we've been so ineffectual at bringing greenhouse gases under control, and why we've now reached such a crisis point. An early indicator of the future opposition to taking action is exemplified in the presentation in 1989 by Duane Levine, Exxon's Manager of Science and Strategy Development, to Exxon's Board of Directors. His presentation marked a significant shift in Exxon's attitude. He shares Exxon's revised position that the greenhouse effect is surrounded by too much scientific uncertainty to be considered credible. He discusses the atmospheric systems, attempting to show that the greenhouse effect is caused by natural influences. And he then goes on to discredit the scientific models used to predict the future impacts of climate change. He concludes by conceding that fossil fuels are the cause of the majority of carbon dioxide emissions, but also states that global temperatures have only risen slightly, not enough to confirm the greenhouse effect. This was the year after Jim Hansen had addressed the US Congressional Committee and told them he was 99% certain that the Earth was warmer now than at any time in the past when it had been possible to actually record the temperature. After carrying out research on climate change since the 60s and being in step with the findings from other research groups, from this point onwards, Exxon began to spread doubt and uncertainty about the science. The Second World Climate Conference was held in Geneva in 1990 and was more political than the first conference. The IPCC presented its first assessment report. Before the conference, scientists had issued a strong statement highlighting the risk of climate change. However, at the end of the conference, the ministerial declaration disappointed many participating scientists and observers through its lack of high-level commitment. Eventual developments led to the establishment of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, of which the Kyoto Protocol was a part. The British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher made a significant contribution to the conference, encouraging the world to work together and to take action. She said, "The danger of global warming is as yet unseen, but real enough for us to make changes and sacrifices, so that we do not live at the expense of future generations. No one should underestimate the imagination that will be required, nor the scientific effort, nor the unprecedented cooperation we shall have to show. We shall need statesmanship of a rare order." Margaret Thatcher had made a similar speech 2 years earlier to the Royal Society in London. The US President George Bush told the IPCC, "The United States is strongly committed to the IPCC process of international cooperation on global climate change." He made a long presentation and appears to have been genuinely interested in and aware of the implications of global warming. He said, "We know that the future of the Earth must not be compromised. We bear a sacred trust in our tenancy here, and a covenant with those most precious to us, our children and theirs." The Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro was held 2 years later. Its aim was to reconcile world economic development with the protection of the environment. And it was the largest gathering of world leaders at that time, with 117 heads of state present and representatives from 178 nations. Some of the industrial nations, and specifically the United States, were criticised for their obscenely high consumption of the world's finite resources, including food, water and energy. Bush's commitment seemed less certain at this point. In response, he said, "The American way of life is not up for negotiation, period." The late 1980s and early 1990s was a time when the United Nations started to bring the world together to try and develop a coordinated strategy to reduce emissions and to avoid the potential impending dangers from increased global warming. The IPCC was created in 1988 and has 195 member countries. It's created to provide policymakers with regular scientific assessments on climate change. The assessment reports are a key input into the international negotiations to tackle climate change. The Earth Summit in Rio led to the formation in 1994 of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it has 197 parties. Its key objective is to stabilise greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that would prevent dangerous interference with the climate system. The framework sets non-binding limits on greenhouse gas emissions for individual countries, but contains no enforcement mechanisms. The framework outlines how specific international treaties may be negotiated to specify further action towards the objectives of the Convention. The Conference of the Parties, better known as the COP, is the supreme decision-making body of the Convention and represents all states that are parties to the Convention. The Secretariat for the COP is based in Berlin, and it reviews the national communications and emissions inventories submitted by the parties. Based on this, it assesses the effects of the measures taken by parties and the progress made in achieving the ultimate objectives of the Convention. The parties have met annually since 1995. The Kyoto Protocol outlined the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions agreed by different countries. Along with this came the Kyoto mechanisms, such as emissions trading, clean development mechanisms, and joint implementation. These mechanisms enable parties to achieve emissions reductions or to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere cost effectively, but in other countries. While the cost of limiting emissions varies considerably from region to region, the benefit for the atmosphere is, in principle, the same wherever the action is taken. Most industrialised countries and some Central European countries in transition agreed to legally binding reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, averaging between 6 to 8% below the 1990 levels, and these were to be achieved between the years 2008 to 2012. This became defined as the first emissions budget. The United States would be required to reduce its total emissions by 7% below its 1990 levels. Al Gore was involved in developing the treaty, and Bill Clinton signed the treaty for the United States, but the US Congress refused to ratify it. George W. Bush's administration, which was to follow, explicitly rejected the protocol in 2001. Denial of the science of climate change has been developing since the late 90s, but was given considerable impetus by Kyoto and the US Congress's opposition and their failure to ratify the treaty. Organised campaigning to undermine public trust in climate science is associated with conservative economic policies and backed by industrial interests opposed to the regulation of carbon dioxide emissions. A 2016 paper reported that more than 90% of papers which were sceptical on climate change originated from right-wing think tanks. Despite previously publishing research broadly in line with the standard views on global warming, oil companies organised a climate change denial campaign to disseminate public information. The strategy was similar to that organised to deny the hazards of tobacco smoking by the tobacco industry a few years earlier. The year after the Kyoto Protocol was signed, the American Petroleum Institute launched its secret plan to spread uncertainty about the science of climate change. The plan was signed by representatives of Exxon, especially Randy Randall, who was Exxon's senior environmental advisor, and the plan included a multi-million-dollar, multi-year budget to instill uncertainty in the public policy arena. Target audiences included the media, public policymakers, and science teachers. The plan considered victory would be achieved when the average citizen understood there were uncertainties in the climate science. In October 1998, Exxon produced a 12-page booklet entitled Global Climate Change, Everyone's Debate. The booklet said, "We take seriously our responsibility to conduct our operations in an environmentally sound way. For that reason, for many years, we've carefully studied and worked to increase understanding of the issue of global climate change, often referred to as global warming. It's one of the knottiest and most contentious scientific subjects. Essentially, the question is whether the use of fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, and coal is causing Earth's temperature to rise beyond normal variation. Our analysis indicates that the current state of climate science is too uncertain to provide clear answers to many questions about global climate change. Even if global warming were a proven threat, which it is not, targets agreed on in Kyoto, Japan, fail to provide fair, practical, or a cost-effective solution." Sir David King was government chief scientist from 2000 to 2007. In 2004, he said, "Climate change is a far greater threat to the world than international terrorism. The United States has failed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Without immediate action, flooding, drought, hunger, and debilitating diseases such as malaria will hit millions of people around the world. As the world's only remaining superpower, the United States government is failing to take up the challenge of global warming." Tony Blair put global warming on the agenda for the G8 meeting in Gleneagles in July 2005. The hoped-for joint declaration to tackle global warming was unsuccessful due to the US's long-standing opposition to emissions targets. The other members of the G8 had already ratified the Kyoto Protocol and committed to reducing their CO2 emissions by 2010. Before the meeting, a joint declaration by the Academies of Science from all the G8 countries on the need for urgent action on global warming failed to shift the US negotiating position. George Bush said he recognised the surface of the Earth is warmer and that an increase in greenhouse gases is contributing to the problem. However, he said the Kyoto Treaty was not the answer, but he didn't provide any other alternative. The Stern Review provided what could have been a really valuable contribution to our fight against climate change. Nicholas Stern was the chief economist and senior vice president of the World Bank from 2002 to 2003. He was recruited by the Chancellor Gordon Brown and became second permanent secretary to the Treasury. In 2005, he was asked to conduct a review on the economics of climate change. The review discusses the effect of global warming on the world economy, and it states that climate change is the greatest and widest ranging market failure ever seen, presenting a unique challenge for economics. It provides prescriptions, including environmental taxes, to minimise the economic and social disruptions. The Stern Review's main conclusion is that the benefits of strong early action on climate change far outweigh the costs of not acting. In 2006, 4 years before he was become Prime Minister, WWF took David Cameron to the island of Svalbard, high in the Norwegian Arctic, to see for himself the impact of climate change and to gain a deeper understanding of the causes of climate change, and of course to make the most of the photo opportunity offered. The promise of environmental action was at the heart of rebranding the Conservative Party as modern and compassionate. Vote Blue, Go Green was the slogan. That same year, David Cameron erected a wind turbine in his North Kensington home, but was forced to take it down again after neighbours complained it was an eyesore and he didn't have planning permission. The Climate Change Act was steered through Parliament by Ed Miliband, the then Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change. It was passed almost unanimously and given royal assent in November 2008. The Act made it the duty of the Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change to ensure that the net UK carbon account for all 6 Kyoto greenhouse gases for the year 2050 is at least 80% lower than the 1990 baseline. The Act aimed to enable the United Kingdom to become a low-carbon economy and gives ministers powers to introduce the measures necessary to achieve a range of greenhouse gas reduction targets. An independent committee on climate change was created under the Act to provide advice to the UK government on these targets and related policies. 2009 wasn't a good year for those trying to combat climate change. The Tyndall Centre's computer server was hacked, Nigel Lawson formed a climate skeptic think tank, and COP15 in Copenhagen turned out to be a disaster. The Tyndall Centre was founded in the year 2000 to conduct cutting-edge interdisciplinary research and provide a conduit between scientists and policymakers. The centre is a partnership between the universities of East Anglia, Cardiff, Manchester, Newcastle and Sussex. On the 17th of November, hundreds of private emails and documents containing personal information about scientists were hacked from the Climate Change Unit's computer server in Norwich. On the 19th of November, an archive file containing the data was uploaded to a server in Tomsk, Russia, and then copied to numerous locations across the internet. Climate skeptics said the email showed that the important data behind the climate change debate had been manipulated. Sentences and phrases from emails were taken out of context to try and discredit researchers and throw doubt on their research and the science behind climate change. The Guardian reported that the computer used for the hacking was based on the east coast of America. Several subsequent inquiries have indicated the work and the science of the Tyndall Centre. On the 23rd of November 2009, Nigel Lawson and Benny Pisa, in the run-up to the Copenhagen Climate Summit, launched the Global Warming Policy Foundation in the House of Lords. Lawson was Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Thatcher government from 1983 to 1989 and was a significant opponent of the 1998 Climate Change Act. Benny Pisa is a social anthropologist who acknowledges that he's not a climate scientist and had never claimed to be one. His interest as a social anthropologist is in how climate change is portrayed as a potential disaster and how we respond to it. On its website, the Foundation says of itself, "The Global Warming Policy Foundation is unique. We're an all-party and non-party think tank and a registered educational charity which, while open-minded on the contested science of global warming, it is deeply concerned about the costs and other implications of many of the policies currently being advocated." The Foundation sets out to create doubt about the fundamentals of climate change in the public's mind. On the 4th of December, Simon Heffer wrote in the Daily Telegraph, "I'm not convinced about the notion of man-made global warming. Thermomania has become the latest rallying point of the leftist renter mob. That so many respectable people feel happy getting into bed with international anarchy would be funny, were it not so threatening to our futures." COP15 had the overall goal of establishing an ambitious climate agreement from 2012 when the Kyoto Protocol expired. However, before the conference, President Obama and other world leaders had decided to put off the difficult task of reaching a climate change agreement, agreeing instead to make it the mission of the Copenhagen conference to reach a less specific agreement that would move the most difficult issues into the future. The conference didn't achieve a binding agreement for long-term action. A 13-paragraph political accord was negotiated by approximately 25 countries, including the US and China, but it was only noted by the COP as it was considered an external document, not negotiated with the United Nations Framework Convention. Developing an accord to replace and continue the commitments made in Kyoto was kicked into the long grass until 6 years later at COP21 in Paris in 2015. After the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats formed a new coalition government in 2010, David Cameron addressed civil servants at the Department of Energy and Climate Change. He told them his new coalition administration would be the greenest government ever He told them, "There's a fourth minister in this department who cares passionately about this agenda, and that is me, the Prime Minister. Right? I mean that from the bottom of my heart." In his 2011 speech to the Conservative Party conference, George Osborne said, "Yes, climate change is a man-made disaster, and yes, we need an international agreement to stop it. But Britain makes up less than 2% of the world's carbon emissions to China and America's 40%. We're not going to save the planet by putting our country out of business. So let's at the very least resolve that we're going to cut our carbon emissions no slower, but also no faster than our fellow countries in Europe. That's what I've insisted on in the recent carbon budget." 4 years before he was to become President of the United States, Donald Trump said, "The concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make US manufacturing less competitive." David Cameron's passion for the environment had faded after 3 years in government. In November 2013, both The Sun and the Daily Mail reported he'd said to his team, "We've got to get rid of all this green crap." Apparently, Tory High Command were reported to have privately abandoned Mr Cameron's pre-election mantra, "Vote Blue, go Green." It's vote blue, get real now, and woe betide anyone who doesn't get the memo, the source said. David Cameron had struggled with the climate sceptic wing of the Conservative Party and the Tory supporting press. Over the previous 4 years, a number of climate sceptic articles had appeared in the Daily Telegraph, Daily Mail, The Sun and the Daily Express, from a number of climate sceptic columnists and leader writers, including Stephen Glover, Christopher Booker, James Delipole, Lord Turnbull, Benny Pisa and Simon Heffer. Apart from criticising the stand taken by Cameron, they continued to reinforce uncertainty about climate change in the public's mind. In 2009, under a headline, "Forget Climate Change, Save the Planet from the Thermomaniacs," Simon Heffer, deputy editor of the Daily Telegraph, wrote, "I'm not convinced by the notion of man-made global warming. My lack of conviction, I will be the first to admit, is based on nothing resembling great scientific understanding. I've not so much as an O-level in physics or chemistry." Also, the thermomania has become the latest rallying point for the leftist renter mob. That so many respectable people feel happy getting into bed with international anarchy would be funny, were it not so threatening to our futures. 3 cheers for David Davis and the Tories who think like him, who are at last telling Dave that this particular bit of grandstanding and bunny hugging has the potential to cause the most extreme economic and political damage. At last there is recognition, not just there are two sides to every story, but that when a politician conspires to limit argument, it's always an attack on the public interest. And so, if next week the Copenhagen summit passes from fraudulence to complete collapse and misery and panic breaks out, no one should feel it's the end of the world, yet. In 2014, Sir David King, who was the government's chief scientist and Foreign Office advisor on climate change, said, "Climate change is not the biggest challenge of our time, it's the biggest challenge of all time." In 2020, Sir David declared he was prepared to speak out in court on behalf of 5 members of Extinction Rebellion. By 2014, David Cameron's love of wind turbines had gone. In response to opposition to new wind farms from local pressure groups, he said, "People are fed up with onshore wind farms being built, and enough is enough." The Conservatives said they would not subsidise any new onshore wind turbines if they won the 2015 general election. The Prime Minister also criticised the religiosity of fracking critics, saying he would be happy to see shale gas drilling in his constituency. "Fracking is a nascent industry that needs a tax regime to encourage it to get going," he added. 1 month before the 2015 Paris climate meeting, the UK government axed the £1 billion grant it had promised for developing new carbon capture and storage technology. The 2 bidders in the competition were Peterhead Power Station, supported by Shell and Scottish and Southern Energy, and the White Rose scheme at Drax in North Yorkshire. Carbon capture remains a key part of the IPCC strategy to reduce emissions, and a reliable and sustainable carbon capture technology would enable gas power stations to continue until industry has made the complete switch to renewable energy. COP21 in Paris was focused on putting together a global strategy to control emissions after the Kyoto Protocol had ended in 2012, It was aimed to pick up where the Copenhagen summit in 2009 had failed so badly. The anticipated key result was an agreement to set a goal to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade compared to pre-industrial levels. The agreement called for zero net greenhouse emissions to be reached during the second half of the 21st century. The parties also agreed to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade. On June 1st, 2017, Donald Trump announced that the United States would cease all participation in the 2015 Paris Agreement. He stated, "The Paris Accord will undermine our economy and put us at a permanent disadvantage." Trump's climate skepticism had been a great encouragement to other world leaders who had similar views. Scott Morrison became Prime Minister in Australia in 2018, replacing Malcolm Turnbull, and then going on to win the May 2019 general election. Australia exports more coal than any other country in the world. While he was Treasurer in the Turnbull government, Morrison brought a lump of coal to Parliament and presented it to his fellow members, stating, "This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. It won't hurt you." He accused those raising concerns about the environmental impacts of coal of being driven by ideology or pathological fear. Jair Messias Bolsonaro became President of Brazil on the 1st of January 2019. He served notice to international groups such as the World Wildlife Fund that he would not tolerate their agendas in Brazil. He also came out strongly against lands reserved for indigenous tribes, and he rejected the scientific consensus on climate change and repeatedly threatened to withdraw from the Paris Agreement during his election campaign. He cancelled Brazil's offer to host the 2019 UN Climate Change Conference, and his Minister for Foreign Affairs called global warming a plot by cultural Marxists. On the 24th of June 2019, the government amended the 1998 Climate Change Act to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. Many consider the bill was too timid, but Britain was the first major nation to propose such a target, although Scotland had agreed a target of net zero by 2045 a little earlier. On the 28th of April 2019, the Scottish Parliament declared a climate emergency, making Scotland the first country to do so. This was quickly followed by the National Assembly for Wales on the 29th of April, and the Parliament for the United Kingdom declared on the 1st of May. Bristol City Council's declaration of a climate emergency in 2018 was the first such declaration by any governing body in Europe, and a breakthrough followed by many cities and national parliaments and local councils. In the summer of 2019, Donald Trump enjoyed a state visit to the United Kingdom and was given a state banquet at Buckingham Palace. The leaders of the Labour and Liberal Democrat parties refused to attend the banquet. During his visit, he spent 90 minutes talking with Prince Charles about climate change. Trump said of Prince Charles afterwards, "He's really into climate change, and I think that's great. What he really wants and what he really feels warmly about is the future. He wants to make sure future generations have climate that is good climate, as opposed to a disaster." And I agree. Speaking later at the G20 summit in Japan, he dismissed the need to tackle climate change, saying, "We have the cleanest water we've ever had. We have the cleanest air we've ever had. I'm not willing to sacrifice the tremendous power of what we've built up over a long period of time and what I've enhanced and revived." The President also claimed that wind power doesn't work because it has to be heavily subsidised. The United Nations produces an emissions gap report every year, and the last one was published in November last year. It shows us that we're still on target for a 3.2 degree temperature rise. And there's a stark warning from the director of the United Nations Environmental Programme, Inger Anderson. Also in November last year, the government called a halt to shale gas extraction, or fracking. Fracking at the Quadrilla site in Lancashire in August caused a 2.9 magnitude earth tremor. and there was an indefinite suspension after a report by the Oil and Gas Authority said it was not possible to predict the probability or size of tremors caused by the practice. Business Secretary Andrea Leadsom said it may be temporarily imposed until and unless extraction is proved safe. Roll back to 2014, and David Cameron said, "People are fed up with onshore wind farms being built. Enough is enough." The ban on subsidies for new onshore wind farms is to be lifted by the government, reversing a 4-year ban introduced by David Cameron. The ban resulted in a significant drop in onshore wind development, just as advancing technology meant the price of onshore wind energy had dropped sharply. In 2015, George Osborne cancelled a major project to develop carbon capture and storage. In the March budget this year, the Chancellor said, "Carbon capture and storage is precisely the kind of exciting technology where Britain can lead the world over the next decade. The plan is to establish one cluster by the middle of this decade and a second by 2030. Once up and running, these clusters will store millions of tons of carbon dioxide that would otherwise be released into the atmosphere. The new clusters will create up to 6,000 high-skilled, high-wage, low-carbon jobs in areas like Teesside, Humberside, Merseyside or St Fergus in Scotland." Where I live, the local shoot breeds pheasants for the shooting season, and they can often be found wandering along the roads. I often think they are the most stupid creatures in the world, and then I think that's probably unfair to the pheasants, and I have to think again. In the 30 years since 1990, while we've continued to prevaricate and hedge our bets, and while politicians have been unable to develop or agree a consistent policy, and the interests of the economy have always taken priority over those of the planet, the rate at which the planet is changing has continued unabated. 19 of the 20 warmest years on record have all occurred since 2001, with the exception of 1998. Since 1990, global land surface temperatures have risen by almost 0.6 degrees centigrade. And in the last 30 years, global carbon dioxide emissions are greater than the total emissions in the 240 years from 1750 to 1990. The daily monitoring of atmospheric carbon dioxide at Mauna Loa shows an atmospheric carbon dioxide rise of 61.29 parts per million. Between 1993 and 2019, sea levels rose by 95.7 millimetres. The Arctic sea ice September minimum fell from 6.14 million square kilometres in 1990 to 4.32 million square kilometres in 2019. Arctic sea ice is now reducing at 12.85% a decade. Since 2002, the Greenland ice sheet was reduced by 4,708 gigatons, and the Antarctica ice sheet by 2,794.8 gigatons. Between 1990 and 2016, the world lost 502,000 square miles of forest, an area larger than South Africa, or in fact larger than 5 times the area of the United Kingdom. And that doesn't include the area equivalent to yet another half the United Kingdom lost in the Australian bushfires at the end of last year and the earlier part of this year. The threat of crossing a number of unstoppable tipping points has increased significantly and has probably already passed for some. And over that period, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has held 27 conferences of the parties. This all does look pretty depressing, but there are some signs we're moving in the right direction, but oh so slowly. United Kingdom greenhouse gas emissions have continued to fall since the Climate Change Act was passed in 2008. In 2018, greenhouse gas emissions were 44% below 1990 levels. Much of this decrease is due to the move from use of coal to gas for our energy generation. However, the Office for National Statistics said the UK had become the biggest net importer of carbon dioxide emissions per capita in the G7, outstripping the US and Japan, as a result of buying goods manufactured abroad. The United Kingdom has outsourced much of its manufacturing since 1990. A look at most of the hardware, domestic appliances, houseware and textiles will demonstrate that others are producing carbon dioxide on our behalf. 2019 was a record year for UK renewable electricity generation, which increased by 8.5% compared to 2018. Renewable share of electricity generation was a record 36.9%, an increase of 3.8% on 2018. And our renewable electricity capacity rose to 47.4 gigawatts by the end of 2019, a 6.9% increase over the year, with around half of this increase due to offshore wind. UK electric vehicle share of car sales were expected to rise from 3.4% in 2019 to 5.5% in 2020. And a food and drink report from Waitrose indicates that 1 in 8 Britons are now vegetarian or vegan. Research by the Building Services Research and Information Association indicates that around 22,000 heat pumps were installed in the UK in 2017, an annual increase of 18%. And in the last 18 months, public awareness has increased considerably through the activities of Greta Thunberg, David Attenborough, and Extinction Rebellion. So there we are, 2020, and some have still got their heads stuck in the sand. The total frustration to me is that climate scientists understood the basic science in the 1960s. They understood the drivers for climate change. The predictions of Gilbert Plass made in 1956 were shown to be more or less spot on by 2005. And the daily monitoring of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by David Keeling at Mauna Loa showed an unremitting increase year on year for the last 62 years. And Jim Hansen, in his testimony to the US Congressional Committee in 1988, said global temperatures are starting to increase. But the biggest frustration is that scientists from Exxon and Shell were carrying out research in parallel to universities and government research institutes. They carried out the same analyses and they came to the same predictions of the future. We've learned a lot from COVID-19. One thing we have learned is that politicians can take notice of scientists when they want to or when they need to. We've learned a lot of other lessons as well. New ways of working, etc., new ways of living together, and a greater appreciation probably of the environment. And I just hope some of these things can be taken forward in our fight against climate change. The worry is that governments now trying to reboot their economies after the pandemic will actually put climate change on the back burner. I think the COVID-19 pandemic will be seen like the Spanish flu, as a very unpleasant blip in the development of mankind in history. But climate change is an impending chronic disaster, a breakdown of climate systems and ecosystems that have supported the development of Homo sapiens for the last 500,000 years. Climate change is long past being a spectator sport. Like it or not, we're all part of the game, and the game can still be won or lost. There's no winning line that we can cross to know we've made it. No thermometer on the wall to show that we've done enough. The only reward we can have now is that our grandchildren might one day look back and thank us for the sacrifices and changes we'll all need to make to protect their future. Please don't be a spectator. We can all make a difference for good or otherwise. Thank you for listening.